Hey guys, today I'm going to teach you how to convert between fractions and decimals. This kind of math could be really useful if you were a basketball player and you made 7 shots out of 20 attempted shots. Then you would need to know your free throw percentage. We go from fraction to decimal to percent. So by the end of this lesson, you should be able to convert between fractions and decimals. So go ahead and get out your binder, turn to the math section, and get ready to take some notes. Let's get started with some review. Like I said, fractions are decimals, which are percents. So fractions, decimals, percents, they're all the same thing. They're just parts of a bigger whole. We looked at last year easy ones, like 1/2, we know is like having 50 cents or 50%. 3/4 is like quarters, and if you have 3 of them, you have 75 cents. And then whenever we moved the decimal over 2 times, we got our percentage. So percent means out of 100. So this is what we learned last year. But what we're going to look at today is how do we do more difficult ones like 3/8 or 5/6? How can we get those to be decimals and then percents? So you should be looking at this handout with me. Make sure your pen or pencil is in your hand. You're going to fill this in as we go, and then we're going to do some examples. So this is the fractions and decimals lesson. Like I said, values can be represented in several different ways. A fraction can be represented as a decimal or vice versa. We can go back and forth. So we're going to start with converting fractions to decimals. So the way to do that is to convert a fraction to a decimal, divide the numerator by the denominator. In case you forgot, the numerator is the top part of a fraction, and so that means that the denominator would be the bottom part of the fraction. Remember, as we go through this video, please feel free to pause at any moment that you need to catch up or to finish writing anything down, and I would write down anything that I do in your page. So let's go ahead and start with this. Let's scroll down a little bit and look at some examples. So let's just start with this first row down here where it says 3/8. I want you to go ahead and try to remember, just from what we just talked about, which part of this fraction is the numerator. Pause, think about it, and then press play when you know. Okay, so you should have paused and thought about it, and the numerator is 3, and then the denominator is 8. So the way to do this is to divide the numerator by the denominator. So I'm going to set this up like a long division problem. So this is the no calculator way. I've got an 8 on the outside, and then I've got a 3 underneath. I can't have 8 go into 3, so what I do is add a decimal, and then I add zeros after it. Then I think, how many times can 8 go into 30? That's 3 times evenly. 3 times 8 is 24. Subtract. 6 is left. 8 doesn't go into 6, so I keep adding zeros. I keep adding zeros. So now how many times does 8 go into 60? That would be 7. 7 times 8 is 56, and so on. So you keep going, and you might need another piece of paper or your whiteboard to do this. You keep going. 8 goes into 40 5 times, and then you'll see that that is as many times as it can go into it. You put a decimal right here, so you're going to end up putting a decimal right up above it. So 3/8 is the fraction, 0.375 is the decimal. So again, that's the no calculator version. That's the long division way to do this if you didn't have a calculator available to you. But since you do, go ahead and just pick up your phone and go to the calculator on it and type in 3 divided by 8, and you'll also get 0.375. We'll come back to these in a second. Let's just go ahead and go back up to the notes. So the next thing it says is to convert a decimal to a fraction. Here's the instructions. We're going to put the decimal over 1 and then multiply the numerator and the denominator by 10. We're just going to move that decimal over until there is no longer a decimal in the numerator. Then simplify your fraction. Let's go ahead and go to question 7 so we can practice with an example. The instructions we just wrote down said to put the decimal over 1 and then to multiply both the top and the bottom by 10 until there's no longer a decimal. So I'm going to go ahead and multiply the top by 10 and the bottom by 10. So we'll get a new fraction. When you multiply by 10, you can always just move the decimal over 1 time. It's just a trick that always works. So 3.5 is on the top. 10 times 1 is 10. So we're going to keep going until there's no longer a decimal in the numerator. So we're going to multiply by 10 over 10 again. So remember the trick. Move it over 1 time. So now you have 35 over 10 times 10 is 100. Now the last thing we wrote down was to simplify your fraction. So we're going to think of what number goes into both 35 and 100. That's how we simplify fractions. I know that 5 goes into 35 7 times, and I know that 5 goes into 100 20 times. I can't simplify any further, so 7 over 20 is the same thing as 0.35. If this feels like a lot and this is overwhelming you, go ahead and take a second and just breathe. This is the first day we're doing this, and this is the first example we've looked at. So I know it's a lot, but just take a second, give yourself some grace, and be patient. We're going to learn this. We're going to have a lot of practice with this. So let's go ahead and look at the next section. Now we're going to look at what types of decimals we have. This is just vocabulary. It says if a fraction converts into a decimal that eventually stops, we'll call it a terminating decimal. If you've ever seen the movie The Terminator, he will end you. He's the scary Arnold Schwarzenegger guy. I will end you. That's what I always think of. If there's a decimal that ends, we'll call it a terminating decimal. For example, the ones we just looked at, 0.375 is a terminating decimal. It comes to an end. It doesn't keep going. Otherwise, if a fraction converts into a decimal with a repeating block, we'll call it a repeating decimal. So that's kind of common sense. For example, if you've ever looked at the number 1/3, you would end up typing that in your calculator, 1 divided by 3, and get 0.3333333 forever and ever and ever. We recognize that repeats, so we call that a repeating decimal. And instead of writing that, math people are lazy, and we just put a little hat on the number that repeats. So now that we have those two definitions, let's look back at our practice that we started with. The instructions for this say practice converting the following fractions into decimals. We've already done that for the first one. Then state what type of decimal it is. So let's look at what we just saw with 3 divided by 8. We got 0.375. And like we just said, this is a terminating decimal. Let's go ahead and look at number 2, the next example. If you think you can do this by yourself, feel free to pause and then keep trying it and then press play whenever you're ready to check. But if not, follow along with me and then pause whenever you think you're ready to try it. So we're going to look at 1/16, converting 1/16 from this fraction to a decimal. I'm going to go to a separate page. I'm going to do it over here, and then I'm going to come back and put it in the box. So you might want to do the same thing with your little whiteboard or with a piece of paper. So looking back at the notes that we wrote, it says to convert a fraction to a decimal, divide the numerator by the denominator. So we're just going to follow instructions. This is kind of a review of long division because we're going to set all these up like long division problems. So the 16's on the outside, put a 1 down there on the inside. 16 does not go into 1, so we'll add a decimal and then add a 0. 16 still doesn't go into 10, so we put a 0 here. And remember, we put a decimal here, so we're going to put a decimal right on top. So since 16 didn't go into 10, we'll just keep adding zeros. Now we think, how many times does 16 go into 100? I don't know off the top of my head, so off to the side on a calculator, remember, you have your phone, you have a calculator. I would just try some 16 times 5. That's 80. Then I try 16 times 6. That's 96. So I know that that's closest to 100 without any extra. So I know that it goes in 6 times. And then underneath, you'll want to write your answer, 96. So then you subtract. There's 4 left over. 16 does not go into 4, so I'm going to keep adding zeros. 16 goes into 40 2 times evenly. 16 times 2 is 32. Now subtract. You borrow. There's 8 left over. 16 doesn't go into 8, so I add a 0 again. Keep adding zeros. 16 goes into 80. 5 times. 16 times 5 is 80. So now there's nothing left over. So now I can see that this is a terminating decimal. It comes to an end, and it's 0.0625. So if you haven't already, I really want you to try the next one by yourself, and then press play and check with me. But I'm going to go ahead and do the next one on a separate sheet. 5/6 we're converting. So I'm going to go ahead and write 5/6, and then I'm going to write it like I'm doing long division. So at this point, please pause, try the first step, and then press play whenever you think you got it. So the first step for me is to realize 6 doesn't go into 5, so I'm going to add a decimal, but I know 6 goes into 50, so I remember I keep adding zeros. 6 goes into 50, 8 times evenly. And remember, since I put a decimal here, I want to bring the decimal right on top of it. So 6 times 8 is 48, and then I subtract like normal. So now I'm thinking 6 does not go into 2, so I got to keep adding zeros. You might want to extend your line out. Remember, please try this, then press play. So if you got to this part, make sure that you pause and then try it yourself, and then press play when you're ready to check. I know that 6 goes into 20 3 times evenly, so 6 times 3 is 18. I'm just going to keep doing long division. And then you're going to start seeing a pattern. So this is where it gets a little trickier. We just did this. We just got 20. Now we're going to do it again. So 6 goes into 20 3 times. 6 times 3 is 18. Subtract, I get a 2. 6 doesn't go into 2, so I'm going to add a 0. Keep going. 6 goes into 20 3 times. You should start seeing that I'm going to keep doing this over and over and over and over and over again. That's your clue that this is going to be a repeating decimal. So this is definitely repeating, and it repeats here at the 3. So the way you want to write this is 0.83 with a line just over the 3. And remember, this is a repeating decimal. So the same 5/6 is the same thing as 0.83 repeating forever. So for 4, 5, and 6, the next 3 in this section, I want you to practice those independently. And then you can check your answer with the answer key that I'll post or in our live class. So let's go ahead and look at our next section. This section, we are practicing converting the following terminating and repeating decimals into fractions. So we already looked at 0.35 or 35 hundredths into making that a fraction, a simplified fraction, and we got 7/20. So let's go ahead and remind ourselves of the process. Remember, you have these notes in front of you. You should be looking at to convert a decimal to a fraction. We put the decimal over 1 and then multiply the numerator and denominator by 10 until there's no longer a decimal in the numerator. So let's look at this 0.275. We're going to put it over 1 and then we're going to multiply both by 10 until there's no longer a decimal. Remember, the trick is if you're multiplying by 10, you can just move the decimal over one spot. So 2.75 over 10 times 1 is 10. So I'm going to go ahead at this point and go to a different page because I know I'm going to take up a lot of room in this box. So remember, we're going to keep multiplying by 10 over 10 until we get rid of that decimal. So we'll move it over 1, 27.5 over 10 times 10 is 100. We don't have we have a decimal in the numerator still, so we're going to keep multiplying by 10 over 10. Move it over 1, and now we're good. So 275 over 1,000. One hint at this point is if you go to your Desmos calculator and you type this in, it will convert it to a decimal for you. And then if you click the fraction button, it will turn it into a simplified fraction. So you do have a calculator available to you that does do this. It's the Desmos calculator that we bookmarked already. If you don't have a calculator handy, you'll need to think about what we remember from maybe 5th grade or 6th grade when you simplify fractions. You find your greatest common factor between your numerator and your denominator. I know that 5 goes into 5 and goes into 100 or 1,000. So I know I can divide both of these by 5. So I'll divide both by 5. And I will use my calculator for this because I don't need to be wasting my time doing all this math. You're in 8th grade now. You can do this. So when I did that, I got 55 over 200. And then if you know anything, any little hints and tricks about simplifying fractions, you know that you look at your last digit. 5 and 0 are both clues that they're both divisible by 5. 5 goes into 55 and 5 goes into 200. So I'm going to keep dividing by 5. Now, when I do that, I know that I get 11 over 40. And then 11 and 40 have no common factor. So 11/40ths is my final fraction. I want you to try number 9 by yourself, but I will get you started. You would read this decimal as 8.12 or 8 and 12 hundredths. So you know that you're going to have 8 on the outside and it's going to be a mixed number. So 8 and something. So you might just want to go ahead and start by doing that and then think, since it's 12 hundredths, you would read that if it was a decimal. You can go ahead and put 12 over 100. That's if you multiply it by 10 2 times. You move the decimal over 2 times. 8 and 12 hundredths is where you'd start. Then you simplify from there. So go ahead and pause and see if you can simplify 12 hundredths. So hopefully you realize that these are both even numbers. They're both divisible by 2. 12 divided by 2 is 6. 100 divided by 2 is 50. And I know that they're both even numbers again, so I know I can divide by 2. So 6 divided by 2 and 50 divided by 2 leaves me with 3/25. And remember, I had an 8 on the outside. So 8 and 3/25 is my most simplified fraction. Let me go ahead and look at number 10 and 11 with you. I'm going to give you a big old hint here. Whenever you have a number dividing by 9 on the bottom, that means you're going to get a repeating decimal just like this. And it's going to be the same number repeating. So this is just going to be 8/9. So 9 on the bottom with that number that's repeating on the top is what that's going to mean. So the same thing goes for number 11. This is 0.11 or 0.1 repeating. So I'm going to know I have a 9 on the bottom and just a 1 on the top. Just a quick, easy shortcut to remember because we know that if it was 0.8, for example, it would be 8/10. So it's like going down 1 gives you that 8. So I want you to try number 12 on your own, and that'll be another one that we look at in live class. So now we can look at 3 word problem examples. These are a little bit more difficult, but I want you to try these 3 all by yourself and then press play and you can check. Please pause now, try all 3 of these problems, and then press play when you're ready to check. Okay, so you should have just paused the video, tried the problems, and now you're ready to check the problems. Don't watch this part until you've already tried this by yourself. So question 13 says, Amber has $5.55 in her pocket. Express this amount as a fraction in simplest form. So remember, whenever we convert from a decimal to a fraction, I always just write it like I read it. I could read it like 5.55 or $5.55, but I could also remember 0.55 is the same thing as 55 hundredths. So I know that it goes over 100, but you could also multiply it by 10 2 times to move that decimal over. So I know I've got 5 and 55 hundredths. Now remember, this is supposed to be in simplest form. This is not in simplest form until there is nothing that goes into 55 and 100. So I know that 5 goes into 55 and 5 goes into 100. So I'm going to divide both by 5. 55 divided by 5 is 11, and 100 divided by 5 is 20. So I have 5 and 11 twentieths as the fraction for 5.55. Let's look at number 14. It says Cody's new dog weighs 7 2/3 pounds. Express this weight as a decimal. So we're going to remember that the 7's on the outside. So the final answer is going to be 7 point something. So I'm not going to fool with that 7. I'm just going to mess with the 2/3. So we're going to look at 2/3. So we're going to set it up looking like this. I'm going to extend that out because I know that 3 doesn't go into 2. So I'll put a decimal. I'll go ahead and make sure that I add my 0. And I think, how many times does 3 go into 20? 3 goes into 20 6 times evenly. 6 times 3 is 18. And so I'm going to keep going. If you notice, I already see a pattern. 3 goes into 20 6 times. 18, 2, just continuing on. I can see right now that the 6 is going to be repeating. So when I write this as a decimal, I want to write 7.6 with a line over the 6 to designate that it's repeating. If you have a calculator, you could have typed in 2 divided by 3 and gotten the same thing. So let's look at number 15. It says Trish entered a problem on her calculator that gave her this result on the screen. It says 0.189452 Would this decimal be considered a repeating decimal? Why or why not? So the key part of this right here is this ... That means that it's going to keep going. When we ... it means we're going to keep going. So this isn't ending. So you might think it's repeating, but there is no pattern in this decimal. I see a 1894528. There's nothing that's repeating in here. Repeating means something happens multiple times or over and over again. Like it could be 18181818 or 189189189. But in this decimal, there's no pattern. There's no repeating. So your answer for this could be no, there is no repeating block in the decimal. So at this point, as we're getting near the end of the lesson, there's a spot at the bottom of this page that says summarize the lesson. This is just a point for you to reflect, put a couple bullet points for some short-term memory things that you might need to take away, some things to remember. That way, whenever you look back at this, you'll be ready and you have like some go-to notes that you've jotted down. All right, guys, that's it. If you made it to the end of this video, please put your favorite emoji in the comments. Today, we went over how to convert fractions and decimals. So now you should be able to convert between fractions and decimals and realize they're just the same thing, just written a little different. So now I want you to go back to the calendar and complete any other assignments you have left for the day. Let me know if you have any questions. Bye.